Welcome today to Georgetown University. Welcome on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies, the Mexican Embassy here in the United States, the Wilson Center, CDE. We are delighted to have you here today as we take up this really important conversation on public perceptions. The title of our event today is Mexico and the United States, Mutual Perceptions. This is something that began in a conversation, gosh, a few months ago now, when Ambassador Gutierrez, who had just begun as ambassador to the United States from Mexico, he gathered a number of us together and said one of his main concerns was addressing the mismatch between the closeness of relationships between the United States and Mexico and the perceptions of those relationships. So while since NAFTA and gosh, over the last century, relationships have become ever more intertwined, especially our economies ever more intertwined, there seem to be often significant gaps in our understanding one of another. The United States often misperceiving or not quite understanding the relationship to Mexico, and Mexico also at different moments having very varied understandings of the United States. In fact, in recent months we've seen a tremendous decline in appreciation of the United States from Mexico. In fact, one of the data points that Chris may mention is that China is now more respected from Mexico and from Mexican perception than is the United States. So Ambassador Gutierrez said, could we do a conference on this? Could we get people together to think deeply about this, to analyze the public perceptions, talk about the way they contribute to our shared understanding one of another, and then look forward to ways that we could build a more productive future. So today we've assembled a great group of speakers who will talk about this. They'll be moderated by our own John Daly, professor of government here, long-term leader in the Center for Latin American Studies. But we'll begin with some remarks from the Deputy Chief of Mission, from Ambassador Zalagoita, who will speak to us and open the conference for us. Good. So Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much, Father Carnes, and on behalf of the Embassy of Mexico, on behalf of Ambassador Gutierrez, I'd like to first of all thank the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University for hosting us and for contributing to making this idea possible. Also to CDE, Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas in Mexico City, to the Pew Research Center, and to the Migration Policy Institute, who also have been part of this, and very especially to Chris Wilson from the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Mexican Institute and the Woodrow Wilson Center, for putting forward a very all-encompassing and high-quality paper on which to have our discussions. For us, it is very relevant to precisely now hold this seminar, this conference, and to do it in such a way that we understand better the impact that policy has on public opinion, and also on how can we get across our message and a positive image of both countries to the respective societies in order to get better public policies towards each other. So that is the relevance of the gathering today, that is the relevance of the discussions today, and I think that we are at a turning point in our bilateral relations, one in which if we are able to move forward and manage things positively and collaboratively, we will really get into a great new stage in Mexico-US relations. But otherwise, if we are unable to surmount the negatives and the difficulties that we are having on misperceptions on both sides, we're in danger of moving backwards several decades in the relationship. So that is the relevance, and that is the importance that Ambassador Gutierrez and the Embassy assigned to this conference.
Good.
Dr. Bailey.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I want to turn now to Chris Wilson. Please, would you go right ahead? And do you want to be over
Why don't
here,
I stand just so I
Good.
can see people and people can see me?
Thanks, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you to everyone, Father Carnes, everyone at Georgetown for the opportunity to be a part of this exercise. I worked together with Pablo Bardas and Enrique Enriquez to put together a small thought paper. And I'll present some of the findings from it right now, and then we're going to publish it after we sort of take into account some of the feedback that we've gotten and maybe some more that we get during this conversation today. But really what we wanted to do was just, we were sort of asked to look at the state of public opinion and think about the implications of that on the bilateral relationship and where we're at in the bilateral relationship. So we tried to begin that type of a process. And I just want to share a few observations from it right now. Oops, this isn't clicking. Maybe I can just use there we go.
There you go. You got it.
That's easy. Good. So the first point that I want to get to, the first point that I want to make is that, there's been a big improvement in the quality of official relations between the United States and Mexico since the 80s, really since NAFTA especially was put into place, but since the 80s even. And it's been more or less a state of steady improvement. I mean, there have been maybe some ups and downs along the way there, but I think a lot of people closely involved in the bilateral relationship would say that, as of 2016, we were really at a high point in terms of bilateral cooperation and working together on common challenges. Nonetheless, when we look at public opinion in the two, from both sides, the Mexican public opinion of the US and US opinion of Mexico, it doesn't follow that same clear trend towards improvement. There's a lot more ups and downs that happen along the way. And one of the things that, just observing some of the polling data and some of the relationship itself that I get worried about from this is that maybe the public's been left behind to a certain extent as the relationship has improved. That officials, because of domestic political constraints, have not always been willing to fully engage the public in conversations about the importance of the relationship and about the need for cooperative solutions to common challenges. And so some of the things I think about when I'm saying that are the failure of the Security and Prosperity Partnership, SPP, during the mid-2000s, which was ultimately characterized by a fringe opposition, mischaracterized as an EU integration-style effort in the United States, and that sort of derailed the effort here. I think of conversations I've had with people in the Department of Commerce who for years have debated whether or not they should even use the word NAFTA when they talk about US-Mexico trade because of the negative connotations that come with that. I certainly think about the constraints on the ability to have any dialogue between the United States and Mexico on real immigration policy issues in the US because it's a very charged political issue in the United States. But I also think about on the Mexican side, the greatly increased security cooperation between the United States and Mexico that happened through the 2000s and now into this decade as well, but that was intentionally done fairly quietly. Because of a concern that there would be a sort of nationalistic response in Mexico, that there would be concern that the gringos were, too involved in what's going on the ground in Mexico. And so there's essentially, I would say, a decision made from both sides that progress could be made in terms of the bilateral relationship, but that it should be incremental, quiet, not require Congress too often or at too deep of a level, both because of political and public opinion constraints. And I'm concerned that quietness, that incrementalism, kept us away from having important conversations as publics in both nations about the importance of the bilateral relationship, and that maybe we've left the publics behind as the relationship has progressed. We see here, this is just sort of our overall compiling a lot of different data sources of US perceptions of Mexico. We see that of course, there are some big ups and downs. One of the observations from this, I'm gonna fly through some of these, would be that, sort of two reflections on this. Ups and downs tell us that there's malleability, that opinion can change, right? That maybe we don't have strong attitudes, but that these are flexible perceptions that can be changed by thought leadership, by circumstances, by economic circumstances, by on-the-ground circumstances of what's going on in Mexico. In particular, we can look at sort of during this period where we had increased crime and especially increased reporting on crime and violence in Mexico, a big decline, maybe also associated with economic conditions in the United States, but certainly a trough there. Another thing to note is just that at this point, we're actually, despite all the rhetoric that we've all lived through in the last year, at a pretty strong point in terms of US perceptions of Mexico. Almost 2/3 of the United States, people in the United States are expressing a strong or a favorable opinion of Mexico. Nonetheless, it's complicated This is just questions from the LaPop survey this last year. What do people think about when they think about Mexico? And the overall one is here on the left. So, even if they have 2/3 favorable views of Mexico, a lot of people are thinking about negative things when they think about Mexico. They're thinking about drugs and violence and poverty, corruption. These are broken up by age group, with younger people on the bottom and older people on top. And age is this thing I'm going to keep coming back to here. But younger people have better views of each other, less negative views and stronger positive views on both sides of the border and in both directions. And that's both an opportunity and a risk that I'll touch on a bit more as we go forward with some of the conversation here. But again, I want to come back to this, what I just mentioned, sorry, I'm going to do this next one, is that for a U.S. opinion of Mexico, security is a really big factor. And when I say security, I mean sort of security, governance, rule of law issues in Mexico. It's really strongly impacting U.S. perceptions of Mexico. I mean, one of the things we saw was just that overall trend, but there's other polling, and this is just some evidence that it's an important topic in the bilateral relationship, especially for Americans. And what I guess I want to say there is just that, there is a big drag on public perception of Mexico and the United States based on this issue. And it's a real issue, and the perceptions, while maybe misguided in some ways, are also accurate in many ways. And this will continue to be a challenge in perception and in bilateral relations, as long as it's a challenge on the ground. And so there's a sense in which reality dictates some of the challenges that we have. I want to make clear that this is not just a media campaign issue. It's not just it's a deeper set of issues than just that. In terms of Mexican perception of the U.S., I mean, the big finding, the takeaway right here, right off the bat, is that it's just crashed. Right? Over the last year, Mexican perception of the United States has declined tremendously. It had been on a pretty strong upward tendency for quite some time. If we go back and look at some other surveys, I use this one because it goes up to 2017, and Gerardo, who helped do the survey, is here from CIDE. You can see clearly the crash. But if we go back and use some other surveys, we see there have been some ups and downs along the way over the last couple decades in terms of Mexican perception of the U.S., especially around the period of the Iraq War. There was a decline in Mexican perception of the United States. One good thing to note is that it recovered, right? Things can recover. This isn't necessarily this really awful number that we have right now isn't necessarily our destiny forever. But it's a real red flag, I think. And like I said, I'll keep coming back to this. But one of the reasons it's such a red flag for me is because we have this younger generation in Mexico that's really been exposed to a much more positive period in U.S.-Mexico relations. That's sort of a NAFTA generation, that this is the first time in their lives they're being exposed to this level of acrimony and tension in the bilateral relationship. And I think we ought to be really thoughtful about the implications of that, because that's, on the one hand, this younger generation and their more positive views is a huge opportunity for the bilateral relationship. It's an opportunity to get rid of this challenge where the public has not necessarily been brought on board with policymakers, and where policymakers are fearful of engaging the public in a full discussion about the relationship. For the younger generation, there's a much greater opportunity to do so. But now there's also a lot at risk. There's a lot at risk because you have a generation that's been brought up around a more positive relationship that's now being exposed to a more tense time, a more negative time, and that could potentially impact their views for the long term. And so I guess what I want to say there is that what's at stake now in terms of policy making this year, next year, may go far beyond and have implications that go far beyond this year or next year, but may be influencing the future generation, their perceptions of one another in the two countries, and as a result of that, what's possible for the next generation of policymakers in bilateral relations. I think there's quite a bit at stake, maybe more than we recognize when we just follow the headlines of what's going on in terms of discussions today. Talked about that. Within the United States, there's this huge trend of political polarization. It's not just about Mexico, it's not just about trade or NAFTA or anything like that. It's a broad trend within the United States of polarization. It runs across several different lines. It's a rural-urban gap. It's a gap based on race, on age, on levels of education, on other factors as well. But there's this trend towards polarization. What should be particularly concerning to those who follow the U.S.-Mexico relationship is that Mexico has gotten caught up in that in a very strong way. and that perception of Mexico itself has become polarized in a partisan political way. This just shows it, in terms of Democrat versus Republican views of Mexico. That's got to be really concerning that, in terms of thinking towards the future of the bilateral relationship, that if it remains a partisan issue, if it becomes entrenched as a partisan issue, that means there will always be opposition to policies that promote cooperation between the two governments and the two societies. That should be a great concern for anybody who cares about that type of cooperation and believes that it's actually useful for both of us. It also importantly spans not just, Mexico in terms of perception, but the issues that matter most in the bilateral relationship. So we see the same type of polarization occurring on issues like NAFTA, trade in general, on migration. So the issues that are of core importance to the bilateral relationship. NAFTA has always been divisive, especially in the United States. We've long had a population that is more or less half in favor, half against, ambivalent views as a society. I think we're seeing very clearly that when you have those types of views on a policy that's fundamental to a bilateral relationship, to an economic system, that's dangerous. It's dangerous to only have around 50% support for a policy that is meant to be creating a foundation for a relationship, because it puts it at risk. It means that there's an inherent instability when only around half the population has been brought on board. It's actually, we've seen opinion in the United States of NAFTA improve slightly in recent years, but that hasn't had an impact on the politics of it so much because there's been this polarization going on at the same time. The polarization is actually kind of strange when it comes to trade and NAFTA in the United States, because it runs contrary to what policymakers have, the traditional coalitions in terms of Republicans and Democrats and the positions of policymakers. So what we've seen is that Democratic opinion on NAFTA has become much more favorable, while Republican opinion on NAFTA has become much less favorable. It's not just a Trump effect, I should make that very clear. There's not a whole lot of intervening data in this chart, but there's other data points that show us that this partisan divide on NAFTA is something that's been underway for the last 7 or so years. But there's this divide that's happened, and it runs contrary to the coalitions that the parties have generally had. So Republicans, as a part, having the business community as part of their coalition, tended to be more pro-trade, pro-NAFTA in terms of policymakers, whereas Democrats with labor have trended in the last several decades to be more trade skeptical. We're seeing an instability in terms of that as well in U.S. politics, right? And that was something that, of course, the Trump campaign took advantage of and used very effectively to pull some Democratic voters over to their, or at least independent voters, over to their side to win in states throughout the Rust Belt, in particular states where there's high levels of trade skepticism. So there's a certain instability on this trade issue that we should be watching and see how it plays out in U.S. partisan politics. But again, we see this huge polarization. In Mexico, NAFTA is more popular. There's more favorable attitudes towards NAFTA. There's still dissent. There's still disagreement. But very few people in Mexico actually would like to see NAFTA done away with. The vast majority of people in Mexico, either want to see NAFTA remain as it is or be improved upon. There are, of course, some divides there according to things like level of education. There's an elite, broad public opinion gap on the issue as well. Some other interesting things that we're not going to go into in great detail here. I spoke about a couple times already this issue of youth and risk and opportunity there. Here's some of the numbers that I was referring to in a specific sense related to that. But just to reiterate that, I think what this tells us is that there's a tremendous opportunity to build on the better views held by young people in the relationship, but also a lot at risk right now. And then let me just close with one final slide and an observation. Interaction helps drive understanding. It's probably not crazy to think about that, but if you remember the word clouds that we saw at the beginning, what some of those positive views that people in the United States held of Mexico, I don't know if you saw them, but they're things like beaches and beautiful and tacos. Many of those formed by travel, apparently, right? Experiences or a vision of travel in Mexico as a tourist destination. So clearly that's fueling some of the positive opinion in the United States. I was sort of exposed to in the earlier conversation that we had some other findings that back this up, that show that people in the United States who have experienced Mexico firsthand do have, there's evidence that they have stronger, better views of Mexico. People close to Mexico, along the US border, there's some interesting findings there. We definitely see that they see a huge need for cooperation on economic issues and understanding of economic interdependence. They have a good impression of their neighbors themselves, of the people, the population across the border. But there's some new evidence from the recent Pew survey that suggests that they may actually not have as favorable views of Mexico itself. And so there may be some complications, some complexity that people have that have the most experience of Mexico based on proximity have in the United States. Very importantly, we found in terms of looking at literature on tourism and experience abroad and how that impacts public opinion and understanding, that tourism itself, just on its own, can have some positive impact perhaps, but it's not totally clear in academic literature what that impact is. When it becomes really clear that it's a very positive impact is when you start talking about things like student exchange, volunteer opportunities abroad that are connected to learning opportunities, when you sort of add depth to that experience that people have when they go abroad. And so I just think that that's a place where we need to really be looking at in terms of opportunity to provide sort of depths of reserves of goodwill in the relationship. And it's an area that we should also be concerned about right now, because there's a lot of concern in the United States about travel to Mexico and study abroad in Mexico due to perceptions and issues of violence. And on the other way, there's a lot of concerns right now and some evidence that numbers are declining in terms of Mexican travel to the United States based on this atmosphere that's perceived as unfriendly in the United States. So there's again, there's a lot at stake, because there are these cycles that can be mutually reinforcing in terms of understanding or distance, in terms of not experiencing one another and therefore being more distant and not understanding one another, or of having a cycle, a virtuous cycle of greater understanding and greater experience with one another. Those are our sort of preliminary findings, and now we'll get to be contradicted by all the real experts here on the
Thank you very much, Chris, and congratulations to you and Pablo Parras and Enrique Enriquez, your co-authors. A very good paper, very able summary. We've organized this to hear perspectives from the U.S. and perspectives from Mexico, and so I'm going to call on Andrew Seeley and Ms. Pushter, Mr. Pushter, to please give us each 5 minutes of perspective from your point of view. Got it?
Can everyone hear and see us from here, or should you want us up there? What's easiest? Yes, this will work? Up there? Okay. Chris, that was great, actually. And
Yep.
Rather than contradict you, I think I'm going to just repeat things you said, not just because we worked together for years and years. I think there's sort of 3 points that I would add to this, which will really overlap with some of what Chris said. I mean, the first is to say that contrary to the rhetoric, let me just say what he said already, Americans' perception of Mexico is getting better, right? And Americans' perception of immigrants is getting better, and of Mexican immigrants in particular is getting better, at least in the last 4 years, year by year has improved. And those things don't have to track, but they often track, interestingly enough. I mean, Americans' opinions of immigrants and Mexican immigrants with opinions of Mexico is one of the tangible encounters, as Chris talked about, people have with Mexico. And I think there's some reasons for this. I mean, I think there's some concrete reasons. I mean, one is Mexico is more in our lives in the United States than it's ever been. It's certainly true in trade, it's certainly true in shared productions. I mean, Chris has written about a great deal where we actually make things together in both countries and Canada. It's true in the food we eat. The consumption of tortillas quintupled, increased 5 times over 20 years. We eat a lot of tortillas in this country. Now, some of that's Mexican immigrants and their children, but a lot of it is it became part of the American diet. How many people have eaten a Korean barbecue taco recently, right? I mean, at least seen that on the menu, right? I mean, when Korean barbecue gets put in a taco and not in a bun, it tells you a lot about tortillas becoming part of the American diet. When wraps, what are wraps? Wraps are wheat tortillas, right? I mean, this is, wraps become part of the health food diet as the alternative to bread. It tells you how much Mexican food becomes embedded in the United States. Two-thirds of Americans say that they eat Mexican food regularly. Okay, I mean, it is quite, and some of this stuff is, I have a book coming out, by the way, an ad, I have a book called Vanishing Frontiers that looks at some of these points of engagement. It will be out in April or May. And so, you know, about a tenth of the beer that we drink is Mexican beer. Right? Far and away, 2/3 of the imported beer is Mexican beer in this country. Dos Equis and Corona and Tecate and all that, Pacifico now. You know, it's actually, I walked this sort of in at Topo Chico, if anyone who's from Monterey. I mean, Topo Chico mineral water, which is a really local thing, was in my local barbecue joint, okay? Now granted, we're in DC, but still, you know. If you look at the fact that, you know, you have a Mexican, you know, 2 Mexicans who win the Oscar for Best Director 3 years in a row, you look at the connections between Silicon Valley and Guadalajara in terms of the innovation communities. You look at, well, you begin to look at things going on inside the United States, like intermarriage rates between people of Mexican descent and people not of Mexican descent, which is incredibly high. You know, just the fact that the numbers of connections that people have, and particularly younger people have in this country, to Mexico has gone up. So I think, you know, check that on the side of why it is, do we see people more favorable to Mexico? A lot of it has to do is that Mexico is more in our lives. It's a much more concrete reality for many Americans than it was, and particularly for younger generations than it was for older generations. That said, and some of the issues went down. I mean, though there's lots of crime in Mexico, the stories that were constant in 2008, 9, 10, 11 about, you know, public killings in the street have not actually come back, even though homicide rates have gone up. And John Bailey knows more about this than anyone else. We could talk about why that is, but you don't have sort of the drumbeat around that. Unauthorized immigration has gone down. So some of the irritants in the relationship and some of the things that generate perception are probably not there in the same way. So that's probably another piece. That said, you know, and as Chris said, there is a hardcore, large minority of Americans who really don't like Mexico, who really distrust Mexico. And that preceded Trump, but it has been politically used, and it certainly has been politically successful. And I would say it partially has been successful, and Angelo and I were talking about this earlier. I mean, I think it's been successful in part because you can tie Mexico to several issues that matter, particularly in not exclusively, but particularly in the white working class in the United States. I mean, if we were to actually have, you know, be able to divide out, and I know this is going to be controversial, but whites without college degrees and everyone else, you would actually see a pattern that's pretty strong. This is true of polarized American politics generally. And it's around demographic changes going on, particularly in smaller and medium-sized towns in the United States. Immigration is a big piece of that. It's not the only piece, but it is the politically safe piece you can talk about. You talk about immigration policy. It has to do with economic changes and not actually the industrialization. Industrial production in the U.S., as Antonio Ortiz Mena knows better than anyone else, is on its way up. I mean, it's doing actually very well in the United States. But industrial jobs are on their way down, slowly, but on their way down because of automation, right? I mean, because increasingly things are actually, and when you walk into factories, you can actually see that change happening, right? Instead of 2 people on a machine, as I remember one factory, that some of you know, you have 1 person with 3 machines, right? And a person who knows how to program those machines. And we only have a high school degree, but they know they're tech savvy and they can program them. Heroin. Heroin is a big issue in small and medium-sized America, and it's primarily a white drug, which is a different thing than we've seen in the past, by the way, in the United States. It's not the crack epidemic. This is the crack epidemic for small and medium-sized cities in the United States. And where does heroin come from? Well, again, Mexico. We could easily say, yes, but people got into this through prescription opioids. That's where the crisis started. But again, there's a touch point. And terrorism. Right? You can also stoke fears about terrorism coming across the border. Not that it's ever happened, but again, if you want a symbol, this is why the wall works. Okay, the wall works because all of these things, it's really hard to get angry at machines. You know, it's hard to get angry at someone, at your cousin who's using drugs. It's hard to get angry at the fact that the town is not the way it used to be and that it's changing culturally. But these are all safe things, or terrorists who came in through some anonymous way, right through an airport somewhere and didn't get checked. It becomes a lot easier to find a symbol, and the wall works very well. And so I don't think this is caused by that, but it certainly is. These are changes that have made people think about Mexico, and politicians, and before Trump, by the way, read The Devil's Bargain if you haven't read it, actually, it's sort of the Trump-Bannon story, about how actually other people, Bannon and a couple of you, sold the idea of the wall to Trump. Because it was a symbol that was useful. Because Breitbart was already on this campaign actually about the wall long before Trump got there. Finally, the last thing I'm going to say, and then I will end, is our knowledge of Mexico in this country is still thin. It's greater than it ever was. It's increasing significantly, but it's still thinner than it should be. In many ways, Mexico is a symbol. It's a symbol of our hopes and dreams and anxieties and fears, okay? And it's a symbol of our political polarization, as Chris said. There's nothing we can do about that in the short term other than to try and do some education around the relationship and around Mexico in our lives. And this will change over time as new generations emerge and new generations that actually have a closer relationship with the country on the other side of the border. But in the short term, it's not something that can change. Right now, part of the increase in support of Mexico is probably also Mexico as a symbol, because people who don't like Trump like Mexico, right? People who don't like Trump like immigrants. People who don't like, you know, you could run down 4 or 5 issues. There's an element in which this is one of the many issues. You know, when we talk about Mexico in this country, and no offense to any colleagues here from Mexico and good friends from Mexico, but sometimes when we talk about Mexico, we're not really talking about you. We're talking about ourselves, right? And there's a sense in which some of the debate, yes, is about Mexico and the country next door, but some of the conversation is about our own anxieties and fears, and also our own hopes and dreams. Sometimes the good stuff isn't about you either, right? Sometimes it is. But a lot of the bad stuff really isn't about Mexico. It's Mexico as a proxy for other things that are going on in this country. And we're going to have to sort this out. That polarization is worrying down the road, it's worrying for the relationship, but it's worrying for many things in this country as well, and it's something we're going to need to sort out over the long term.
Excellent. Good. Thanks very much. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mr. Kushner, please.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
I'm going to actually echo most of what you said, just because
Gotta disagree now.
I know, but that tends to be the preeminent issue in American politics and in public opinion in the U.S. is polarization, is the differences between political parties on a variety of issues, including foreign relations, views towards other countries, and sort of immigration and trade policies. This is not something new. Again, it predates Trump, but it's something that's been a case in the American polity for a long time. First, I also want to say that the paper is wonderful in terms of pulling together all the perspectives, public opinion on polling in the U.S. and Mexico on views towards each other. There's a lot of data out there. Sometimes it's not so easy to find. Sometimes it's not so easy to compile. By the way, I work for the Pew Research Center, so I do a lot of this. Primary data sourcing, public opinion in a variety of countries around the world. It's not an easy job, and it's not an easy job to compile. So great job on that to begin with. I also want to just make a point about that. While we're talking about Mexico specifically here, the issue of views towards the United States on decline is not just an issue in Mexico. It's an issue around the world. We surveyed 37 countries this year, and public opinion of the U.S. had fallen in virtually every country in which we asked. And that coincided with a negative view of the U.S. president. So when we asked people in all these countries whether they had confidence in the U.S. president in 2015 and 16, about 64% had positive views of President Obama. When we asked the same question in 2017, that number fell to 22% across all these 37 countries, which means about 3/4 of the world population has no confidence in the U.S. president. And this caused a dramatic change in overall views of the U.S. in total. But of the countries where U.S. favorability fell, the one with the steepest decline was Mexico. And that's probably because of the association in the 2016 election on issues of border wall, immigration, trade, those kinds of issues that sort of are important for the U.S.-Mexican relationship were sort of top of the list of the campaign. So you have, when we ask people around the world whether they support building a wall between the U.S. and Mexico, again, about 75% across the world say that they disapprove of that policy. Mexico, 5% approve of that policy. I don't know who those 5% are, but it's a very low number. So that's something very important to know, that this story of declining views of the U.S. is not just a Mexico story. I'll also say from a U.S. perspective that this polarization, while it seems to be all-encompassing, is not necessarily something that, it's not just party. It's also age, it's also education. There's also other factors that sort of buy into the divisions we're seeing within the United States on public opinion. And, it's been getting wider for years, but you never know if it can turn around at any point. And also, just as a background for views in Mexico, we have to remember, too, that in Mexico, people are also not happy with how things are going in their country. People are not happy with the economy. They're not particularly satisfied with their government, and they're not seeing maybe the benefits that they would possibly be seeing of the economic relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. So there's also very negative opinion in Mexico. So the combination of those two might explain some of the factors of why we see this kind of data. So I guess the big takeaway is that public opinion within Mexico and U.S. can fluctuate over time. It can change based on circumstances on the ground, economics, politics, all those kinds of things. We don't know what it's going to look like in the future, but it's very important that there's an open dialogue and that we have this data to understand exactly what's going on so that we can work and build on policies to help out in the future. And I'll end there.
Good. Thanks very much. Efficiency and clarity. We're going to turn to a Mexican perspective, and Mr. Maldonado. Gerardo, would you please? I don't know how these microphones are working, Gerardo.
I don't know. I think anywhere around there.
Is that where
other light is working as well?
Powerful. Yeah.
Try that.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure to be this morning here discussing this fantastic paper. And I've been asked to talk about the risk for Mexico based on that information. And I see two risks, considering that within a year we are going to have elections as well in Mexico and in the United States. So in terms of the US, as you have already heard, Mexico, and I like the word, it's a symbol. There have been actually nice articles published in different journals and newspapers in Mexico saying that Mexico is chivo expiatorio here in the United States. It reflects a lot of things very well. So it's part of really the polarization. So Mexico is going to be part of the new election. I mean, President Trump has confirmed many limits to do what he wants to do, but specifically in terms of Mexico, there are things that he can do. So perhaps we're going to see that Mexico is going to be part of things that he can do, the things that he will be delivered to people that support it. That's for the American part. But for the Mexican part, I think that for the many years, the United States has not been part of the election, of the discussion of different candidates. I think next year, the U.S. Trump administration is going to be part also of the election. It's going to be part of how people will evaluate different candidates and different parties. People will think who will be the best to manage the relationship with the United States, who will be the best to deal with the new NAFTA situation, with the new immigration and the migration situation. So the risk is that now both countries and the images of both countries are going to be part of the electoral calculus of voters, parties, and candidates. So, and the risk is that this kind of issues will be really polarizing, and then the problem is that has really important effects. I mean, if many people in Mexico voted for a candidate or for a party that goes against the U.S., then the relationship won't be expected to be well. So, because they also have to deliver to their constituencies. So the thing is that these two ideas, I mean, the idea of Mexico in the U.S. and the idea of the U.S. in Mexico is going to be part of the election. We really need to see and take care of that. So the risk is now there is not only an economic and social, but also a political risk of these bad images. That's it.
Thanks, everyone. Good. Very good. I want to invite Antonio, please. Antonio Ortiz Mena, would you please comment? Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the invitation. And I do have to say a word because Andrew and I were colleagues in grad school, and we shared a lot of panels. I used to think of us as some of the Blues Brothers or Men in Black, but I think we're Men in Pink today. Rosa Mexicanos, our colleague.
We like taught together for 20 years or something.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. On and off. Yeah.
It's amazing about the time.
Yeah. So I was asked to give perspectives and risks for Mexico, but I would rather give perspectives and risks from Mexico, from a Mexican perspective, because I think this is a bilateral issue. First of all, I think that we might be reaching, rather than a turning point, a tipping point. I don't know who else read, Malcolm Gladwell's book. So one thing can lead to another, and I am really pretty concerned about the way the bilateral relationship. I'm a specialist on NAFTA. I teach a course here, publicity, ALSP 514, and I hope that my object of study does not disappear, as it happened to your former Sovietologist colleagues.
Yes.
But I think that the problem is not specifically with NAFTA and whether it's this rule of origin or WTO. I think that's besides the point. I think that should NAFTA go off the rails, and I think that's an apt metaphor, it will be very difficult to get the whole bilateral relationship on track again. And it has to do partly with public opinion. As Chris showed, Mexican views of the U.S. just fell off a cliff just very recently, and I think that sets a limit to what political candidates can do throughout the election campaign in Mexico next year. And it doesn't matter if you're AMLO or if you're someone from the PAN-PRD or from PRI. I think that sets limits, and should there be no successful renegotiation of NAFTA, it will be very difficult for any candidate, and I think this is an important point, for any candidate to continue with business as usual regarding the bilateral relationship, be trade and investment, but also security cooperation, and also immigration. And I think that there has been somewhat of a misunderstanding here in the U.S., because Mexican NAFTA negotiators are not, say, negotiating the outer rule of origin, against helping or not with undocumented immigration from Central America. It is just a stark political reality. No political candidate will be able to maintain business as usual. And even more worryingly, I would say that there is a risk of a more permanent damage in terms of Mexican views of the U.S. and of the bilateral relationship. I was a member of a generation together with Ambassador Zabalgoitia that helped to push the famous reset button and Luisa back there. In terms of Mexico-U.S. relations, our parents were really pretty anti-American. That went across the political spectrum, and we've been, I guess, living in a quarter century of more or less constructive relations, and that whole construction can go by the wayside, and the next generation will have just experienced what a lot of Mexicans feel is a sort of betrayal by the U.S. It's not a matter of tariffs or rules of origin. It's a matter of Mexico trying to play along with the U.S., being very constructive for a quarter century, and then we feel the U.S., or at least some groups in the U.S., have turned their back against Mexico. And once that happens, it's really difficult to get things back on track. I don't have any magic bullets, but I think something that has to be done is to bring the level of awareness of Mexico in the U.S. As Andrew said, the knowledge about Mexico is pretty thin. I think it needs to, the level of awareness of the quality of knowledge and of debate has to be raised regardless of what happens. And maybe the current situation is a blessing in disguise, because suddenly these things are coming to the fore. We have a full moon here. So I think we should take the initiative regardless of what happens. With that optimistic tone, I'll go back to my table, John.
Let me consult Father Carnes. We have time for a couple of rounds of questions.
That's right.
Is that it? Let me do it in terms of rounds. That will take 3 questions in each round, and you can address them to Chris and Pablo Parras and Enrique Enriquez to get them all to join in as they wish on this. But just tell us clearly your name so we can all know who you are, and then try to keep your questions shorter than my instructions to you. And you have to speak up because we can't hear.
I'm Jim Breland. I teach international relations here at Georgetown.
Thanks.
And my question is short, but I have a little background. The short part is I'm curious about any evidence of Russia involvement in elections in Mexico.
Okay.
The reason for that is because Russia entered into a defensive pact with Nicaragua about this time last year. It went under the radar. People didn't pay much attention to it. But I think that Putin has a larger strategic interest in seeing more division between Mexico and the United States, because his main goal is to get NATO off of his back in Eastern Europe. And if he could provoke some kind of a crisis a la Cuba Missile 1959, that would work very much to his advantage in getting Western Europe off his borders. So, not to add to any of Dark Cloud's.
Interesting question. Let me take another one here, and we'll do this also in the first round. I feel like an auctioneer. Seeing no bid. Oh, please, yeah. And tell us your name clearly so we know.
Yes, my name is Marichu Gomez. I'm an MSFS student here at Georgetown, and I was wondering, so you're talking about like, sorry, let me just go back. So historically, the relationship between the United States and Mexico has been the one that was close, but at the same time, you mentioned that there was distance in terms of the public perception. So and that has worked well, or at least it has continued to function. So I was wondering if you think that now there's some specific reason why there has to be, both of them have to be equal. Like, why do we need to bring in the public into this relationship?
Okay.
Why do we need to inform the
Right.
public that when we haven't done so in the past? What's the
Okay.
difference?
What's the significance of public opinion and public involvement? Am I with you?
Yes, because in the past there has always been this separation between both of them.
Okay.
So I was wondering why is it, and it's worked. So why is it important to now bring
Okay,
it
good.
together?
I can take a third if there's a question. Please, over here. I can't see very well.
Hi,
Tell us your
I'm
name.
Isabella DiSpirito. I'm a first year in the Latin American Studies program, MA. And I'm interested in the idea that travel and tourism and educational exchanges can improve these mutual perceptions. And I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit more about tourism and how maybe tourism could improve these perceptions in a positive way, but maybe perhaps they would reinforce stereotypes of Mexico as well. So I'm interested if they could say more about tourism or if they know anything more about how that affects public opinion.
Good. I'll come to you on the next round for sure. Chris, you want to start out, and then we can get Pablo and Enrique to maybe offer an opinion?
Sure.
So we have three items here.
Okay, so I don't have a ton to say on the first question, except that there's not a lot of evidence of any sort of Russian involvement in Mexico, and not necessarily a ton of opportunity also to turn Mexico specifically against the U.S. I mean, I think what we do here matters much more, but I'm not trying to discount it. I'm just saying I don't know of any real clear evidence that it's taking place. History, I mean, for your question, I mean, I think it hasn't worked. It's worked in the sense that, yes, we have been able to build a pretty solid U.S.-Mexico official-to-official relationship in recent years, but it hasn't worked, and what's happening right now is evidence of what hasn't worked, right? The consequence of not having the public on board is instability and risk inherent in the policies that are on the table. So the fact that NAFTA, which is a cornerstone of U.S.-Mexico relations, one of the fundamental frameworks for it, is on the line right now, is being debated, is in serious risk, is because, in part, because we haven't brought the public on board to be supportive of it. And so I think that and then, as Antonio points out, then that risk expands outwards towards the rest of the relationship, right? Because one issue that's such a cornerstone of the relationship is on the line. Now we're putting on the line, sort of accidentally, cooperation on security issues, on migration, etc. So I mean, I think that what it is you may not see it always in the data. I mean, and that's the calculation that was made, right? Was that today it's easier for me and you as officials to take the next step in the relationship by not making a big deal out of everything, by not talking really publicly about some of the security cooperation or things like that. But so individually, those decisions can make a lot of sense, right? They can be totally rational decisions individually, yet the collective impact of them can be that we move forward with the relationship without bringing the public on board, and eventually there can be this reckoning, right? And that's what I think we're undergoing right now, is this reckoning
because there's this imbalance in where we're at these two levels. And the democratic process is meant to bring those two levels together, right? Is to bring public opinion in line with policy. And so if we have a functioning democracy, it's not sustainable to have one in one place and another in the other place. And it turns out that that's true. At least right now, we're going to have to deal with it and somehow have a realignment there. Tourism is an interesting case. I assumed immediately that tourism was good for building understanding and relationships, intercultural understanding, public opinion, that sort of a thing. And there's a fair amount of sort of academics that say so, and policymakers that say so, and there's some research to suggest it as well. But there's also a body of research that says, you know what, it's not as important as all you other people think that it is. It's just too light. There's not enough depth of engagement to have real strong impacts on, to create real understanding, right? And so I'm just jumping into that literature. I'm by no means an expert in it. But I definitely found it interesting. One of the takeaways that I had, though, from reading some of the literature is just that when you take that next step and you start to have a deeper level of engagement is when you have clear positive outcomes in terms of building understanding. And one paper found did an experiment where they're even just giving people literature, like a pamphlet, that they take with them before they go on a tourist trip. And that was enough in that case, giving some background information to have a better outcome in terms of intercultural understanding than those who did not receive it, right? So maybe it's not that hard even, but definitely then when you get into the literature on student exchange and things like that, you find real strong positive impact. And so, I guess what that leads me to in thinking about the future of the relationship is that Mexico is the #1 country sending tourists to the United States, the United States is the #1 tourist destination for Mexicans, and Mexico is the #1 tourist destination for Americans. So we have this huge tourism relationship, right? Sending tourists back and forth across the border. That's a huge sort of potential source of improved understanding. But the research I was looking at suggests maybe we need to do a little bit more than just convince people to make that trip to Cancun in order to tap into that benefit potentially associated with that.
Thank you.
Let me invite Pablo if you want to add. Enrique, where are you?
Thanks. I have no idea about Russia. The thought had not crossed my mind until now. Thank you. However, it is very important to know that in Mexico, over the 10 recent years, we have gone from 30% to about almost 70% that are people connected to the internet. So the platform, the structure is there for some elaborate campaign by whoever wants to do it. And my perception, I don't have data on that, is that Mexicans are more socially active in those social networks than, for example, in the United States, WhatsApp and
Interesting.
things like that. So potentially there's a risk, if you will. I won't touch much on the significance of public opinion. I think that the political cost, I agree with Chris, and it might be relevant as you get close to elections, for example, and whoever's willing to use that. If you have good data and how to turn that into symbols like the wall, for example. So I think that's one of the key issues that we need to be aware and track public perceptions and see how we can hopefully use them for beneficial output of the relation. And finally, on tourism and education, I don't think overall the impact of tourism or students traveling will be that much, but I think it's a good example of qualitative ways to impact the perceptions that we have between our countries. My hypothesis, and we're looking into data into this, and I think the larger conversation would be Mexican Americans or Americans living in Mexico and how they can impact, and the hypothesis being that once you have a direct contact, instead of just relying on indirect information, you are more likely, if that's a positive input, to have a better understanding and perception about the other country.
Enrique, do you want to add? Pass the conch.
Okay. So very briefly, I remember that on Russia, there have been like a few articles being published at El Financiero in Mexico. Over the year, I think they started publishing something like this in April, arguing that the National Electoral Institute in Mexico should be seeking stronger measures against potential influence. Like, I'm not convinced this is a really big threat, and I don't think that a lot of people have it in their radar, but certainly there's people writing about it in El Financiero. But second question, I think that NAFTA's problem is largely a public opinion problem. So the people that are participating in NAFTA, the business leaders, the people that are creating jobs and wealth on both sides of the border, they know that NAFTA works. And they favor NAFTA, and they're doing their best to keep it on the rails. However, the general public that does not have anything to do with it are the ones that are voting for the politicians that go against that. So I think it's a great public opinion problem. And when we were doing research on travel and tourism, we found that, first of all, there wasn't a lot of like very in-depth, very thorough research on the impacts. And one thing I would say is that we should also look at, I wonder if there are a lot of countries in the world that have as much tourism as Mexico and the US have between each other. However, Mexico and the US also have like a very particular perception of each other, where both countries have gone, as we saw, through a lot of ups and downs, and they have a lot of negative stereotypes about each other. So I wonder if, I mean, what impact of tourism is here, but what we certainly see is that we need to take care of this only opportunity that we have for like massive interaction between the two countries that, as we have seen in some very preliminary data, tourism from both countries is already going down to the other country.
Interesting. We have time for another round. Please, Alvaro, I didn't give you a chance the first time. We'll start with you, Alvaro, and then I'll take two more.
Thanks.
Alvaro, please.
So I'm Alvaro Santos from the faculty at Georgetown Law. And thank you. I asked this question in the previous session, so it's a follow-up to put the question on the table. I think it'll be productive. So it's about the assumption of the relationship between perception and policy. And I noticed that it seems like the paper assumes that if you have good public opinion, good public policies would follow, or the atmosphere would be more amenable for good public policies. And in particular, there was this assertion that relations between governments and international cooperation between the governments has never been closer since NAFTA. It's been very positive, but public opinion lags behind. And so there, I guess my invitation would be to think about how public opinion is also influenced by other variables that have to do with the outcomes of the policies. So think about the war on drugs or immigration, where cooperation has been close in some quarters, but the outcomes have not necessarily been good. Or the narrative that governments use to explain those bad outcomes also affects public opinion. So in some ways, public opinion, maybe it's more indicative of how people perceive the relations than just the intergovernmental relationship and how it's varying. And so just the last point would be, I'm all in favor of public opinion of Mexico being good in the US and vice versa, but the question would be in favor of what specific policies? So what's the strategy behind? And this is important in the current context because we've seen that public opinion is quite malleable. And so it seems what I'm hearing is the big preoccupation is NAFTA. And so what would be the strategy to foster an increase in opinion about Mexico and connect that to a successful outcome in NAFTA? Do we have an idea about how we would go about doing that, as opposed to thinking of just increasing the public opinion or favorable opinion of Mexico in the
Like a
US?
leverage. Thank you. Let me take a couple more.
That one right.
Hang on.
I'll ask one too.
Okay, good. Well, I'll be sure to do that. Good. Please, George.
Hello, my name is George Corolla. I'm a second year in the master's program here, Senior Latin American Studies. I was really interested by Chris's comments on the intentional quietness that the U.S.-Mexico security relationship has operated, especially within the last decade or so. Do you think that this has led to a negative outlook on U.S. security assistance to Mexico, specifically military and police assistance? Also, what diplomatic actions can officials, or what diplomatic actions, policies, or strategies can be implemented to kind of combat this political opinion that we mentioned today. We talked about tourism, some other available options. Just curious as to your thoughts on some official policies that can be implemented.
Need to go, Father Carnes? Matt, you have a question?
So my question actually follows a lot up on Alvaro's, and it's really constructing a positive narrative out of this. I would propose one idea, very serious, and one a little bit more humorous, but meaningful. The more serious one is really thinking about talking about the narrative of middle class growth and middle class consumer growth between the two economies. Because that seems a place for exchange, and actually where business from the United States has a lot to gain from being invested in Mexico. And the Mexican business now is actually reaping a lot of benefits from middle class consumption in the United States. And that might be a piece that could be emphasized more as you would think about some sort of positive narrative about this, about the bilateral relationship, and maybe even more broadly. And that brings me to the sort of humorous example, but it's one that is interesting. So my colleague at the end of the table, Jim Breland, a few years back had a very interesting thing. He noticed, much like Chris, that we've often, in a sense, not talked much about NAFTA, almost because we were concerned about the red flags that might set off. But he actually commented, maybe we should celebrate this more. And the example he gave was actually creating a NAFTA flag. Okay, I've been looking all over the internet. I can't find the image of it. He actually designed one.
There is one.
There is one, I know.
It's much better than my design.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like a bluish gray with 3 stars in the corner, but I challenge you to find it.
Yeah, no, I can't find it. But my point is this idea of what if we were to think about championing this relationship in some way? What does the public opinion people in the room think about that? Is that a non-starter because we're so worried about setting off red flags, or in sort of almost like counterfactual world, would this have been something that might have helped people think about this more meaningfully, so 20 years down the line there's ownership of it rather than not ownership of it? And especially if you think about the meaningfulness of like the EU flag and being a reference for members of the EU, and believe me, there's a lot of initially, opposition to that, right? Should we fly this in alongside our own national flag, but now we see that's actually become largely accepted for most of the EU. So it's somewhat humorous, but with meaningful symbolism.
Good. Let's do the same methodology and start with Chris, if that works, and then ask Pablo. And
yeah, perhaps some of the other panelists have better thoughts on some of these topics than I do as well. On the relationship between perception and policy, it's obviously a huge topic and sort of area. I mean, essentially that's like what democratic theory starts to get towards, right? I mean, how it is that you collect opinions of people and turn them into policy. And that's a complex formation, but it's real, right? I mean, there's an obvious way in which public opinion transforms into policy. It's through electoral politics. And through interest group politics and all sorts of the other ways that we as citizens try to influence policy. But of course it's more complex than that as well, because there's also thought leadership that is exerted by our politicians and others who have the opportunity to do so. And so it is a dynamic system, but there certainly is this dynamic relationship going on between policy and perception. And I think that warrants considerable justification, considerable concern about the state of public opinion if one accepts as a premise that there are benefits to having a cooperative relationship between the United States and Mexico, which I would certainly argue for. You're right, it's important to say sort of cooperation in favor of what policies and what results does that provide people. I'm concerned about putting too much sort of weight on or too much responsibility on the quality of the bilateral relationship for outcomes that are largely related to domestic policies in each country. So I don't think that it would be fair, and perhaps people do to a certain extent though, judge the quality of the bilateral relationship based on domestic public security outcomes, for example. I think that domestic security, public security in Mexico, first and foremost is something that's the responsibility of the Mexican state to provide. Of course, those of us who believe in the bilateral relationship believe that there's some value added to be put in there, but I don't think it would be fair to sort of judge the quality of the outcomes and domestically in Mexico, by or put that on the bilateral relationship. I think we should be careful in how we do that. Just to say, it's a big topic and warrants a much deeper conversation and a good set of questions. I mean, on this intentional quietness, I don't think that the United States population realizes the importance of cooperation. And I don't just mean that in terms of sort of assistance programs. I think that when we talk about like security cooperation, a lot of people think immediately about sort of Merida and think about that as an assistance program to Mexico. I think that the way that it matters to US security goes much beyond the sort of assistance part of it. It goes to the way in which Mexico helps arrest criminals that are violent offenders in the United States on a regular basis, sometimes extradites them to the United States, shares information about flights coming into Mexico so we can ensure that there aren't terrorists on those flights that plan to make their way to the United States. I think there's a lot that's going on, and why don't we all know about this? Right, because we're not talking a whole lot about this, and that was a conscious decision. That's been a conscious decision made again and again. But I think we need to start talking about it. I mean, this is just my personal opinion, is that if we don't start talking about what those real benefits are in terms of security for people in the United States of having this relationship, then there is this risk that will be out there for sure. And in terms of policies to address the perception challenge, I mean, yes, something like student exchange, maybe trying to find ways to take more advantage of tourism. But first and foremost, I guess I would just say, I mean, what we need strong thought leadership expressed from the top levels in the United States. And what we're seeing right now is a great deal of skepticism about the value of the relationship being expressed from high levels. And so that's not conducive to improve public opinion, which provides a framework for future cooperation. I couldn't agree more on this idea that there's, one of the things that's missing in terms of perception from the United States of Mexico is certainly, I think the economic image that's out there only gets caught, especially if you look at those word clouds, words like poverty and migration, meaning people need to, there's at least a perception of people needing to leave the country for opportunity. There's nothing of this narrative of a transformed Mexico. The image that like tells me of is, it's kind of like a Wild West in Mexico with no rule of law, and maybe, some poor guy beneath a cactus or something. I mean, that's a totally outdated, messed up perception of Mexico, and obviously needs to be addressed in order for people to see Mexico as an opportunity and a partner rather than a receiver of aid and a source of problems for the United States. So I think that would be an important piece of the conversation to add in.
Pablo, you want to add?
Sure.
Please, I have to pass the conch there.
Just quickly to complement, the public opinion formation depends on many things. For example, at this moment, the exchange rate is very important on public opinion formation in Mexico.
Right.
Soccer match result. All of those things can influential. We need to take that complexity into account and see what how we can use it as input. What I think is most important is what Andrew mentioned, that it is a very thin opinion, perception on both sides of the border, and I think that's what we need to work on, because as long as it remains thin, it can be very malleable and just used for any political purpose that is not coming into the relation. In terms of the security issue, just to complement, it's important to remember that how we frame the conversations in security, for example, as Chris was saying, we can try to sell Merida and cooperation, or we can, but it's more easy to sell Fast and Furious and programs like this with the guns, the events with the guns and things like that. So it's much more easier to sell the negative than the positive. And it's also that's related to media consumption. So, and as the data that Chris showed, for example, the party ID divide in the United States, and you're not going to get somebody to watch Fox or to watch CNN, depending on the party ID. Right. That's just a reinforcement cycle that we need to take into account. And I would love to celebrate and try to have a flag, but again, I think it'll be very easy to go against that idea or something like that. But I guess we need to try to find symbols that work and permeate party idea or geography or some perceptions.
Enrique, did you want to add? Are we good? Do we have time, Matt?
I think we do.
We can take what, 2 more?
Gerardo's done a lot on that question of identity also.
Gerardo, please.
Yeah.
One thing that I've been thinking about it recently. I think that NAFTA has been very successful in a lot of things. One is that NAFTA is successful in the public opinion this mechanism needs. I mean, there is support for open common market, and that's it. I mean, this has never been openly to build a community. I mean, if you see, I mean, there are, we have, except for so many people, but it has never been actually the purpose to build a common community. If we want to do that, then we need to do some further steps. For instance, if you think about the European Union is really based on identity.
Right.
We have been very, very bad at building a North American identity. I mean, based on also on public opinion, what is it important? When you ask people, the percentage people feel themselves as North American is less than 8% in Canada, United States, and Mexico. There is no identity. One thing that the European Union did actually was student exchanges. The Erasmus program was a really cornerstone of that. I mean, people need to move and study and live and eat with other Europeans to feel European. That's something that we haven't done here because we haven't wanted really to do that. No. There has not been a real, from the politicians in the three countries, to do that. So the thing, just in one line, perhaps we are stressing a lot on the NAFTA because it needs to be limited, and in that sense, just the public support for a common open market, it's there. Yeah. The limitations only in the U.S., but in Canada and Mexico, actually people is really happy with free trade, investment, stuff like that.
But a thin version.
Yes.
Antonio, you wanted to comment, please.
Yes, quickly on Alvaro's point regarding the link between public opinion and public policy. Of course, it's complex, contingent. A professor will never give a straightforward answer, okay? But I think that in this instance, you can see two effects. First, regarding el muro, the wall, you can see that about 2/3 of Americans are against the wall. 1/3 are in favor of the wall, yet there's still talk about the wall because it makes political sense in terms of the base of support for President Trump. Pretty sure that if the percentage were 0, that would have gone away and maybe he would have latched on to some other idea. So here you have a small but hard segment of public opinion, influencing public policy. On the Mexican side, as I briefly mentioned, I think it sets the limits to what is acceptable for any Mexican politician when he or she talks about Mexico-U.S. relations. And my point is that it doesn't matter if you're center, left, or right. The public opinion that Chris Wilson showed sets limits to what is acceptable. So I think that's just an example of how it's working right now. Secondly, on how to change public opinion on NAFTA, to be frank, I don't think that you can. I think that it's too late. I think that to rescue the negotiation, you need to have decision makers from the national security perspective in the U.S. speak to USTR and economic decision makers to tell them, this is again not about regulatory cooperation. Everyone falls asleep as rules of origin. This has to do with the U.S. national security, right? I think that is the only way that would do it. And lastly, on the sort of intentional quietness, I think that's partly intentional quietness. I think that's also a bit of neglect. Leaving the relationship in autopilot, maybe I should say, was in the diplomacy for many years. I've maybe I could say mea culpa, but I think that's a bit of neglect, not only design, and that if Mexico needs to wrap up its foreign policy, it needs to invest much more, both the federal government and businesses. This is not only a state-to-state relationship. And how would I like to see, Mexico's image change in the U.S.? I wouldn't necessarily say that, my aim would be to say, we love Mexico, we admire Mexico, that's fine, But the point would be for U.S. decision makers to acknowledge that they cannot go it alone.
Mhm.
For example, President Trump has said, if we have an NAFTA, that's fine, and if we don't have an NAFTA, that's fine too. Or you have Secretary Ross saying that the U.S. has a big bazooka, and that because Mexico relies on the U.S. markets for its export, so basically Mexico will do whatever the U.S. wants it to do. I'm sorry, as the Rolling Stones say, you can't always get what you want. I'm sorry, that's what will happen. So I just hope there's more of an awareness of this.
I think the Rolling Stones said it all. Let me turn to Father Carnes. Would you please
Yes.
wrap up for us?
Yes. So mostly I just want to say thank you.
Good.
I want to say thank you to the group for being
Good
here
job.
today.
It's a good paper.
It's really remarkable to think about the arc of programming we've had around the U.S.-Mexico relationship in the last year. So beginning with Ambassador Gutierrez's visit right after he was named. Then Alvaro Santos hosted a fabulous conference on the NAFTA negotiations where we went deep into a pretty deep dive into the negotiations as they're being carried out. And now today. And what's been great about all of these is they, in a sense, embody what we talked about a lot today, which is when we gather colleagues from both sides of the border, we have a better discussion. So the fact that we have CDE represented here, that we have the Wilson Center represented here, that we have Georgetown, that we have Pew, that we have the embassy represented here, that makes us stronger. And these kinds of conversations contribute to the bilateral relationship. So thank you for being part of that today, and something that we will continue here at Georgetown. We're thrilled to be the host of these sorts of things,
Good.
and we look forward to working together. So thank you very much.
Yeah, good.
All right, let me actually.
Just to add, I omitted mentioning Pablo Palas, who did a splendid job in the paper and also in conducting the morning discussions. So thank you, Pablo, and everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.